So I'll share some background for how this conversation, how today's event came about. At the beginning of the pandemic, we launched a campaign called Building Power and Safety Through Solidarity, which you'll hear about the campaign later today. We produced a report by the same name about the campaign. And we did a few presentations about the campaign, which we usually want to do when we want to promote the organization, our work, and the lessons. But when we did it, we found people fixated on the details and whether the situation and the context applied to them or not, rather than taking away the lessons. And so instead of doing a webinar to promote the campaign or the report, we thought it would be better for us as multiple organizations to share our lessons, because several of us are experiencing similar things across the country in our work. Next slide. We are living in the midst of a crisis. The world's richest country, and for those of us in New York, the world's financial capital, have had the worst impact of the pandemic anywhere in the world. Decades of divestment from social services and safety nets, and the shifting of reliance on private corporations has created a system without services or safety unless it is profitable. And this is what we also refer to as neoliberal capitalism. And an example of this is that frontline healthcare workers didn't have safety equipment for the pandemic. And literally a couple of months later, police had not only the highest grade safety equipment, but also weapons to repress protests. And this is a reflection not of just we need to sort of improve things. It is an intentional feature of the system of neoliberalism that we're living in. And the failures of neoliberalism are fueling the right wing and proto-fascist movements that we continue to see through Trump and around Trump, and we will continue to see for the decades to come. Next slide. And so what does this mean for us in the short term? We can see that there's millions of people who are behind on rent, and we're likely going to be facing mass evictions. We're likely going to be facing, we are and will continue to face mass unemployment. And then as foreclosures shut down small landlords and small businesses shut down, that's going to further fuel the cycle of evictions and unemployment. And when people are out of work, when people don't have housing and they're desperate and they're angry, they will control us through policing. And the question for us becomes, do we have the power to be able to deal with these problems or prevent these things? Next slide. To be able to do that, I think we have to be able to look at an assessment of our power. In one example, we see the BLM uprisings, which were the largest protests in US history with millions of people in the street. And it drastically shifted people's consciousness around police, around issues of race, around American history. But the momentum from those could not be maintained and has been co-opted by electeds, partially co-opted by electeds, by corporations, in the name of symbolic concessions, and for the purposes of the elections. And so there was this opening, we made progress, but we couldn't hold on to the progress and couldn't hold on to the possibilities that were created by the opening. And then we had the elections, and the elections showed that our forces can play a very important and decisive role, but not independently. It's not that we have the power to be able to play that role completely independent. We do have to enter into alliances with the Democratic Party, with liberals, to be able to kind of prevent the expansion of the proto-fascist forces. Next slide. And so what do we need? We need base building and people's organizations that can turn the widespread anger and despair that people are feeling into larger politicized, and disciplined basis. And to be able to do that, we need to build both moral power, but also more importantly, social power. Next slide. So moral power is the ability to influence decision makers. This relies on leveraging media, pressure, feelings, personal relationships. It is really just like sort of doing something and hoping that they will take what we're doing into consideration. But social power is really the ability to force decision makers, where they don't really have a choice. It relies on disrupting the functioning of either capitalism or institutions or processes. And so like two quick examples, 100 of us protest outside of a factory with signs. The factory can ignore us. You know, maybe they get some bad publicity, but like we'll get tired and eventually we'll move on and they'll go back to work. But if 100 workers inside that factory stop working, that factory stops functioning and they're losing money. And losing money is their basic function. And so the first one is moral power, the second one is social power. Similarly, 1,000 students in a school district who can show up to meetings, school district meetings, and we interrupt meetings, but they can close off those meetings and still continue to do business. But if we have organized 50 students in one school to organize other students to pull off a student strike, if there's no students going into the school shuts down. The very purpose of the school is disrupted. And so again, that's like a difference between moral power and social power. Next slide. And so for the purposes of the presentations that you'll hear today, we are offering 4 factors to consider in the building of power. Deep base building, which is really about numbers, growing the number of organized people, taking them from everyday people to becoming involved with organizations, and to do this first and foremost amongst the working class. Secondly is to do deep leadership development. That once we've brought people in, training and developing them so that they aren't just passive followers who do what the organizers or staff or more experienced people tell them what to do, but they themselves are actively working, initiating, and innovating for collective liberation. Being intentional about geography. Where is it exactly that we want to build power? And in particular, where can we build power so that it shifts us on the spectrum from moral towards social power? Which neighborhoods, is it particular blocks, are there particular workplaces that are more important than others? And then lastly, to look at the balance between services, mutual aid, and organizing. How do we meet people's needs in ways that allows us to build power and movements to address root causes rather than get sucked into becoming service providers? So these are the factors to keep in mind as you hear the different presentations and also as we will go into the small group discussions. Next slide. So the panel today, we have 4 organizations: Drum, Desis Rising Up and Moving in New York City. The presenters will be Anshu and Sherry. Youth United for Change in Philly. The presenters will be Kat and B. Put People First, Pennsylvania. And the presenter will be Nijmi. Poder in Action. The presenter will be Jenny. We're very excited. We very carefully chose these organizations because they have been doing some of the most cutting edge work around thinking about how are we building actual power. Power that not only increases our influence, but actually increases our ability to be disruptive of the regular functioning of things. And the basic guiding questions that people will use for each one of their presentations is to share a little bit of their background and context. Within that context, what are the concrete ways that they're building power in these times of capitalist crisis? And what are the lessons that they would like to offer for us to consider?